For centuries, the term Dark Ages has conjured visions of chaos, ignorance, and unrelenting despair, a period when civilization crumbled, knowledge was lost, and the world slipped into a millennium of darkness. But was it truly an age of darkness? Or have we misunderstood one of the most complex periods in human history? The Dark Ages, long portrayed as an era of decay, stretched from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 14th. It was a time of shifting powers, collapsing cities, and ceaseless conflict. Between the dying echoes of Rome and the first stirrings of modern Europe, something was awakening. A world was breaking apart and slowly being rebuilt. It began in the twilight of empire. By the late 5th century AD, Rome, the eternal city, once the heart of the known world, was collapsing. Roads deteriorated, trade routes crumbled, and once great cities emptied as people scattered in search of safety. The unified West fractured into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms and rival warlords, each vying for dominance in the ruins of empire. But this was not the death of civilization, it was its transformation. In isolated monasteries and far-flung corners of Christendom, a quiet resistance to the darkness was taking hold. Monks in Ireland and scholars in the Byzantine East labored by candlelight, copying the ancient texts of Aristotle, Plato, and Hippocrates. These fragile manuscripts, preserved against the odds, would one day reignite the intellectual fire of Europe. Outside those walls, the world was anything but still. The rise of the Franks under Clovis, the iron-fisted rule of Charlemagne, the relentless Viking raids that reshaped entire coastlines. And across the Mediterranean, the Islamic Golden Age lit a beacon of scientific and philosophical progress, while much of Europe struggled to find its footing. This was no age of silence, it was an age of extremes, ruin and renewal, violence and vision. So, was the Dark Ages truly 1,000 years of decline, or is that narrative a shadow cast by hindsight? Look closer, and a different story begins to emerge. One of survival, reinvention, and the birth of a new world. We've seen the consequences, now witness the collapse that set it all in motion. The fall of Rome. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling over centuries. In 476 AD, that unraveling reached its breaking point when Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, deposed the last Roman emperor, a boy fittingly named Romulus Augustulus. With that, the mighty empire that had once ruled over vast territories from Britain to North Africa was no more. But what led to this moment? And how did the world reshape itself in the shadow of a fallen empire? The truth is, Rome had been dying for a long time. For over 1,000 years, it had stood as the unshakable center of civilization. Its armies had marched across 3 continents. Its laws had shaped the course of history, and its influence had stretched from the British Isles to the sands of the Middle East. But even the greatest empires are not immortal. Rome did not fall in a single day. It crumbled slowly, rotting from within before the final blow was struck. By the 3rd century AD, the cracks in Rome's mighty foundations had become impossible to ignore. Corruption festered in the Senate, emperors rose and fell at an alarming rate, often assassinated by their own guards. And the empire was stretched thin, struggling to defend borders that spanned thousands of miles. Once, Rome had thrived on conquest, but now, the very lands it had conquered were becoming impossible to hold. Economic turmoil drained its resources. Heavy taxation crushed the people, while rampant inflation rendered the once powerful Roman currency almost worthless. Trade slowed, cities shrank, and once thriving regions were left to decay. Meanwhile, Rome's famed legions, the backbone of its military might, were no longer what they used to be. Where once they had been composed of disciplined Roman soldiers, they were now filled with mercenaries, foreign warriors who had little loyalty to the empire they served. At the same time, a growing threat loomed beyond Rome's borders: the barbarian tribes. For centuries, these groups had lived in the shadow of Rome, sometimes trading with it, sometimes raiding its frontiers. But now, something had changed. The barbarian world was on the move. The first major crack came in 410 AD, when the Visigoths under Alaric stormed into Italy and sacked Rome itself. It was an event that sent shockwaves through the world. The Eternal City, which had not been breached by an enemy army in over 800 years, now lay at the mercy of invaders. St. Jerome, witnessing the unthinkable, wrote in despair, "My voice sticks in my throat. The city that took the world is taken." But this was just the beginning. The Vandals, a Germanic tribe from North Africa, followed in 455 AD, plundering Rome so thoroughly that their name would forever be associated with destruction, giving birth to the modern word vandalism. The Huns, under the fearsome Attila, ravaged the empire's borders, though they never quite conquered Rome itself. Then came the Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric the Great, who later seized control of Italy, marking the final death of Roman rule in the West. Each of these invasions chipped away at what little remained of Rome's former power. The once mighty empire was being carved up by those it had once dismissed as mere barbarians. But Rome's fall was not just about foreign invasions, it was about what happened within. The end came quietly. No grand battle, no climactic siege, just a simple dismissal, a reminder that Rome had already died long before its last ruler was sent into exile. With this, the Western Roman Empire was no more. The eastern half, known as the Byzantine Empire, carried on for another 1,000 years. But Rome itself, the Rome of Caesar, Augustus, and Constantine, was gone. And with it, the familiar order of centuries came undone. When an empire that once held the Western world together collapses, it doesn't just vanish. It leaves behind a power vacuum, and chaos rushes in to fill it. Without Rome's guiding hand, Western Europe fragmented. Its grand infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, public buildings fell into disrepair. Trade routes collapsed, cities were abandoned, and literacy, once widespread, became a rare privilege. With no central authority to uphold law and order, power fell into the hands of local warlords, kings, and chieftains. The Western world had entered what many would call the Dark Ages. But was it truly dark, or simply different? The collapse of Rome did not mean the end of civilization. In fact, new societies emerged from its ruins, each shaping the medieval world in unique ways. The Germanic tribes, once outsiders, now became rulers. The Church, rising from the empire's remnants, soon became the most powerful institution in Europe. And in the East, the Byzantine Empire carried the torch of Roman civilization, preserving knowledge and culture that later fueled the Renaissance. This wasn't just an ending, it was a transformation. A new world was taking shape, where Rome's legacy blended with the cultures that once stood against it. Power no longer resided in marble palaces, but in the hands of those who could command loyalty and survive by the sword. But what kind of world did they create? The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD was not just the death of an empire, it was the unraveling of a world order. In the ruins of Rome's cities and broken roads, new powers rose, not emperors in marble halls, but warlords in wooden ones. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Lombards, Anglo-Saxons, and Franks. These warrior societies had clashed with Rome for centuries, absorbing its strengths while forging a different path. Unlike the Romans, they ruled not with bureaucracy, but with brute force, loyalty, and the ever-present reality of war. Life under these barbarian warlords was brutal and uncertain. The idea of a centralized government had vanished. There were no more emperors enforcing laws, no vast armies to keep the peace. Power was fragmented, with rival kings and chieftains ruling over small territories, each trying to expand their influence through force. The Franks, under the leadership of Clovis I, understood this reality better than most. Clovis did not just conquer, he strategized. By converting to Christianity, he gained the support of the Church, using religious legitimacy to strengthen his hold over his people. This blend of faith and force became a recurring theme in medieval Europe. Warlords needed the sword to seize power, but they needed the Church to keep it. With Rome's fall, its once mighty legions disappeared, and warfare in early medieval Europe took on a new form. Gone were the days of vast, disciplined armies fighting in organized ranks. Battles were now chaotic, brutal, and unpredictable. Most warriors were not professional soldiers, but rather local fighters called upon by their lords in times of war. They fought with whatever weapons they could afford: axes, spears, swords, and bows. But the most crucial piece of equipment was their shield. Shields were more than just protection. They were used offensively to bash enemies and break through enemy lines. Armor was minimal, with only the wealthiest warriors owning chainmail, while most relied on thick tunics or leather for defense. Helmets, often made of iron or bronze, were a luxury reserved for the elite. As warfare evolved, one of the most significant shifts was the growing reliance on cavalry. While early medieval armies were still largely made up of foot soldiers, elite warriors on horseback began to dominate the battlefield. Horses were expensive, which meant only the wealthiest and most powerful could afford them. But those who could became part of a new warrior elite. They weren't simple soldiers. They were bound by personal oaths of loyalty to their lords, fighting not just for coin, but for land, honor, and power. Under Charlemagne, the Franks refined this system even further, creating a military elite known as the Skara, a highly trained cavalry force that became one of the most formidable units of its time. Charlemagne rewarded loyalty with land, tying military service to land ownership and giving rise to the early feudal system. In this new order, warriors became more than fighters. They became lords, rulers of territories, responsible for defense, justice, and governance. This was the birth of medieval knighthood, not as we imagine it in stories, but as a real and powerful force. These men were no longer just warriors. They were symbols of power, protectors of kingdoms, and enforcers of law in a fractured world. But if there was one thing that defined warfare in the early Middle Ages, it was its sheer brutality. There were no rules of engagement, no mercy for the defeated. Captives were often executed, villages were burned, and rulers maintained control through fear as much as they did through loyalty. Siege warfare became a key strategy as small kingdoms and fortified towns became the centers of power. Attacking forces used battering rams, siege towers, and flaming arrows to break through defenses, while defenders hurled stones, poured boiling oil, and rained arrows down on their enemies. Some warlords even resorted to the scorched earth strategy. If they could not hold a territory, they would burn it to the ground so that no one else could use it. Crops were destroyed, wells were poisoned, and entire villages were wiped out to deny resources to advancing enemies. It was a world where survival depended on strength, cunning, and absolute ruthlessness. Yet, amid the bloodshed and fragmentation, something enduring was taking shape. From the chaos of warlords and shifting allegiances, a new order was emerging, rough, unrefined, but lasting. The seeds of medieval kingship, chivalry, and feudal power were being sown in real time, not in courtly halls, but on muddy battlefields and scorched villages. The lines between raider and ruler began to blur as conquest gave way to governance. Castles rose from wooden stockades and titles were forged alongside swords. The Dark Ages, that name lingers, but beneath its shadow, the foundations of the medieval world were being laid, one battle, one oath, one stone at a time. This was not the end of civilization, it was the beginning of a new one. And in the lands once ruled by Rome, that new world began to take shape. As the dust settled from Rome's collapse, the patchwork of warlords that had once fought for dominance began to stabilize into something more enduring. The tribal leaders of the barbarian world were no longer just raiders. They were now kings, ruling over newly formed realms built on the remnants of Rome. Among these new powers, three emerged as the most dominant in the West: the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Visigoths. Each had once been an enemy of the Roman Empire, but now they sought to carve out their own destinies, shaping the course of medieval Europe for centuries to come. The Franks, a Germanic people from the lands along the Rhine, proved to be the most influential of them all. Under Clovis I, they embarked on a campaign of expansion, seizing control of Gaul, the heartland of what would become France. But Clovis was not just another warlord looking for conquest. In a moment that changed the course of history, he embraced Christianity, converting to the faith of the very empire his ancestors had once fought. This decision was not merely spiritual, it was political. By aligning himself with the Roman Catholic Church, Clovis gained the support of the bishops and the Romanized population of Gaul, granting his rule a legitimacy that other barbarian kings lacked. His dynasty, the Merovingians, ruled for generations, laying the foundations of medieval France. And though later rulers would overshadow Clovis, his choice to embrace Christianity defined European kingship for centuries. Further north, across the sea in the British Isles, a powerful new force was taking shape: the Anglo-Saxons. Unlike the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons were not a single people, but a collection of Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who had migrated to Britain following the Roman withdrawal. What they found was a land left vulnerable, its Roman defenses crumbling, and its native population struggling against invasions. Over time, these warlike newcomers carved out their own kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and others, each ruled by a warrior king who fought for dominance. The Anglo-Saxons reshaped Britain, imposing their language, customs, and warrior culture upon the land. Yet, despite their pagan roots, they too ultimately embraced Christianity, forging ties with the wider European world and setting the stage for the kingdom that eventually became England. To the south, another great kingdom had taken root: the Visigoths in Hispania. Once the destroyers of Rome, the Visigoths had settled in Spain and southern Gaul, ruling over a land that had once been a thriving part of the empire. Unlike the Franks or Anglo-Saxons, the Visigoths initially followed Arian Christianity, a belief that put them at odds with the Catholic majority of their subjects. But in time, even they conformed, embracing Catholicism under King Ricard in the late 6th century. This shift unified their kingdom, stabilizing their rule and allowing them to flourish. But by the early 7th century, a new force was rising beyond the Christian world, one that would soon alter the fate of Europe forever. In the arid heartlands of Arabia, a prophet named Muhammad began preaching a message of divine unity. His words ignited a spiritual and political revolution. Within decades, Islam spread with unprecedented speed, uniting the Arab tribes and carving out a powerful empire stretching from the borders of India to the shores of the Atlantic. For the fractured kingdoms of Christendom, and for Byzantium in the east, this new power would redefine the medieval world. Yet while Islam reshaped the Mediterranean, one empire endured: the Eastern Roman Empire, remembered as Byzantium. While the Western Roman world collapsed under waves of invasions, the eastern half held firm against barbarian onslaughts and internal strife. From their capital in Constantinople, the Byzantines carried on the traditions of Rome, though they were no longer quite Roman in the old sense. Greek had replaced Latin as the dominant language, and their emperors ruled with an authority more akin to god-kings than republican leaders. One of Byzantium's greatest rulers, Emperor Justinian, sought to reclaim the lost glory of Rome. In the 6th century, his generals, led by the brilliant Belisarius, launched a campaign to reconquer the western territories, briefly restoring imperial rule in parts of Italy, North Africa, and Spain. Yet, these victories were short-lived. Plague, constant warfare, and the rise of new enemies weakened the empire's hold on the west, forcing them to retreat and focus on survival against growing threats, most notably the relentless advance of Islam. Despite these setbacks, Byzantium remained a cultural and military bastion, its walls shielding Christendom's eastern frontier for centuries. But it was not just kings and empires that shaped medieval Europe. Christianity itself played the most profound role in defining this new world. In the wake of Rome's fall, the Church remained the one unbroken institution, its power growing even as the empire faded into history. This power, however, emerged from chaos. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Europe was plunged into disarray. Roads crumbled, law collapsed, and warlords ruled by the sword. Survival depended on allegiance, not order. Into this void stepped the Church. Monasteries became the centers of learning, preserving ancient knowledge that might have otherwise been lost. Monks copied manuscripts, maintained libraries, and served as advisors to kings. The Pope, once just another bishop within the Roman system, emerged as a supreme spiritual authority, guiding the rulers of Europe and even challenging them at times. Christianity provided legitimacy to kings, sanctifying their rule and offering divine justification for their authority. It also brought about a new vision of warfare, the idea of holy war. As Christianity spread, rulers began to frame their conflicts not just as struggles for land, but as battles for faith. This would become even more significant in the centuries to come, as conflicts with the Muslim world and religious schisms within Christendom itself gave rise to the Crusades and other holy wars. But for now, Europe was still taking shape. The kingdoms of the Franks, Anglo-Saxons, and Visigoths had risen from the wreckage of Rome, Byzantium had endured as a bastion of Eastern power, and Christianity had woven itself into the very fabric of medieval life. The struggle for power was far from over, but the world of the Middle Ages was no longer just a land of warlords and chaos. A new order was emerging, one built on kings and castles, faith and steel. Yet, while kings and warlords carved their legacies through conquest, another kind of empire was quietly taking shape, one built not on bloodshed, but on belief, doctrine, and spiritual unity, the Catholic Church. In a world ruled by the sword, the Church offered something more lasting: moral authority. While kingdoms rose and fell, it endured, its influence stretching across all of Christendom. It was not just a spiritual institution, it was a political power, an economic force, and the guardian of knowledge in an age where learning had become a privilege of the few. The Pope, once a mere bishop in the Roman world, now held sway over emperors and kings. From the grand cathedrals of the West to the remote monasteries hidden in the mountains, the Church shaped every aspect of medieval life. But how did this happen? How did a faith that once suffered persecution under Rome become the most powerful institution in Europe? The answer lies in its survival, its adaptability, and its ability to offer what no king could: eternal salvation. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the Church stepped in to fill the void, offering not just spiritual guidance, but structure, stability, and even governance. It was the one institution that connected the disparate kingdoms of medieval Europe, uniting them under a common faith. The Pope crowned emperors, bishops advised rulers, and monasteries preserved the wisdom of the ancient world. But this growing power did not come without conflict. As the Church expanded its influence, it inevitably clashed with secular rulers who sought to control it. The struggle between popes and kings shaped the political landscape of the Middle Ages, leading to some of the most dramatic power struggles in European history. At the heart of this growing influence were the monasteries, fortresses of faith and knowledge in a world where learning was fading. In the centuries after Rome's fall, the great libraries of antiquity were abandoned, and many classical texts were lost forever. But not all of them. Deep within the stone walls of monasteries, monks labored tirelessly, copying ancient manuscripts by hand, preserving the works of Greek philosophers, Roman historians, and early Christian theologians. The Benedictine monasteries, following the rule of Saint Benedict, became the centers of learning, where knowledge was not only safeguarded, but also expanded. Monks studied medicine, philosophy, and theology, ensuring that the wisdom of the past did not vanish completely. In an age of war and instability, monasteries were islands of stability. They provided education, medical care, and even agricultural innovation. They were self-sufficient communities that not only preserved knowledge, but also spread it, training future generations of scholars, scribes, and church leaders. The famous scriptoriums, where monks painstakingly copied texts by candlelight, became the reason we know so much about the ancient world today. Without them, much of classical civilization's intellectual legacy would have been lost to history. Yet the Church's power was not merely cultural or intellectual, it was political. The Pope did not just lead the faithful, he wielded authority over kings and emperors. The concept of Christendom, the idea that all Christian nations were bound together under the authority of the Church, meant that rulers could not ignore the Pope's influence. If a king defied the Church, he risked excommunication, a punishment that could see him stripped of his throne and his people released from their loyalty. The church controlled vast lands, collected taxes, and even had its own armies. Its power rivaled that of the greatest medieval monarchs, and often the two sides found themselves in direct conflict. One of the most infamous struggles between church and state was the Investiture Controversy, a bitter dispute over who had the right to appoint bishops. Was it the king, who ruled the land? Or was it the Pope, who commanded spiritual authority? The conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire in the 11th century became a defining moment. Henry, seeking to maintain control over his realm, appointed his own bishops, but Gregory excommunicated him, stripping him of legitimacy. Forced to seek forgiveness, Henry made a humiliating journey to Canossa, where he stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days before the Pope finally granted him absolution. The event symbolized the immense power the church held over even the mightiest rulers. But while some kings clashed with the church, others sought its favor. The alliance between the Frankish kings and the papacy had set a precedent. Rulers who aligned themselves with the church could gain divine legitimacy. This bond was strongest in the Holy Roman Empire, where emperors were crowned by the Pope himself, signifying that their authority came not just from conquest, but from God. However, this also meant that kings had to walk a fine line, balancing their power with the demands of the church. Too much defiance could lead to excommunication, while too much obedience could turn them into mere puppets of the papacy. As the medieval world evolved, so too did the church's role in shaping it. It was not just a center of worship, but a political powerhouse, an economic empire, and a guardian of knowledge. Its monasteries kept the intellectual traditions of the ancient world alive. Its bishops counseled kings, and its popes waged wars as readily as any monarch. But as its power grew, so did the tensions between spiritual and secular rulers. By the dawn of the High Middle Ages, Europe was no longer just a land of warlords and feuding kingdoms. It was a civilization defined by faith, where the church stood at the heart of every village, every city, and every court. It had woven itself into the very fabric of medieval life, shaping laws, influencing politics, and defining the moral order of society. And yet, this immense power soon faced challenges unlike any before. The Crusades, the rise of strong national monarchies, and internal divisions within the church itself put its authority to the test. For now, however, the medieval world belonged to the church. It was the one institution that could claim to rule over all of Christendom, guiding kings, shaping empires, and preserving the wisdom of the ages. The struggle between faith and power was far from over, and the greatest battles, both spiritual and political, were yet to come. Even as the church loomed large, it could not fill every void. As it grappled with external threats and internal divisions, the absence of centralized power left ordinary people vulnerable. In this vacuum, a new system emerged, not designed by rulers, but born out of necessity. This was feudalism, the backbone of medieval life, a structure built on land, loyalty, and survival. With no central authority to protect the people, they turned to those who could, local lords with land, weapons, and the means to defend them. At its heart was a simple but rigid hierarchy. A king, in theory, owned all the land, but he granted great portions to his most powerful nobles, dukes, counts, barons, who, in turn, divided their holdings among knights and lesser vassals. Each tier owed service, protection, and loyalty to the one above, creating a chain of obligations that held this fractured world together. Yet feudalism's reach extended far beyond politics. It dictated how people lived, worked, and survived. Power was not centralized in grand capitals, but scattered across thousands of fortified estates. Each manor functioned as a self-sustaining world, complete with its own farmlands, villages, and a ruling lord who administered justice and collected dues from the people living on his land. For the vast majority of the population, this was the only world they ever knew. At the bottom of society were the peasants, men and women who worked the land in return for protection. Some were freemen, renting small plots and owing little beyond taxes and occasional labor to their lord. But the majority were serfs, bound to the land they farmed. Unlike slaves, they could not be bought or sold. but their lives were dictated by their lord's will. A serf could not leave without permission, and much of their harvest went to their master. In return, they received protection from raiders and a small portion of crops to feed their families. It was a harsh existence, ruled by backbreaking labor and the constant threat of famine, disease, and war. While peasants toiled in the fields, the nobility lived in stark contrast, their lives defined by warfare and governance. Above the peasants stood the nobility, the lords and knights who ruled over these estates. They lived in manor houses or castles, overseeing their lands and dispensing justice. Their lives were not without hardship. Feudal warfare was a constant reality, and securing one's territory required strength and diplomacy. Nobles spent their days training for combat, attending feasts and councils, and managing disputes between their vassals. A lord's power depended on the number of knights he could summon in times of war, making loyalty and alliances crucial. Knights were the warriors of the feudal world, bound by the code of chivalry, an ideal that demanded bravery, loyalty, and a commitment to protecting the weak. They trained from childhood, beginning as pages in noble households before becoming squires and eventually earning the right to bear arms. But while stories of knights tell of gallant heroes defending the innocent, the reality was far more brutal. Most knights were enforcers of their lord's will, often engaging in feuds, raiding enemy lands, and upholding a strict social order that left little room for rebellion. Despite its rigid structure, feudal society was deeply personal. Loyalty was not to a distant king, but to one's immediate lord. When a war broke out, it was not a kingdom that marched, but a collection of noble families, each with their own armies of knights and foot soldiers. Alliances were made through marriage, and disputes were settled in blood. This world of castles and vassals was a world of fragile peace, always on the brink of violence. The heart of feudal life was not the bustling cities of the Roman world, but the castle, a fortress built to withstand attack and serve as the center of a lord's power. The first castles were simple wooden palisades atop earthen mounds, but as warfare evolved, so did their defenses. By the 11th century, towering stone keeps and curtain walls became the standard, turning castles into nearly impenetrable strongholds. These fortresses were not just military bases, they were homes, administrative centers, and symbols of authority. From within these walls, lords ruled their lands, held court, and prepared for the constant threat of war. Beyond the castle lay the village, where peasants lived in small thatched roof houses. These villages were self-sufficient, with fields divided into long strips, each assigned to different families. Peasants grew wheat, barley, and vegetables, while livestock provided milk, wool, and meat. The manor's blacksmith crafted tools, the miller ground grain into flour, and the local priest tended to spiritual needs. Life revolved around the seasons, planting in spring, harvest in autumn, and surviving the bitter hardships of winter. Trade was limited in the early Middle Ages. Roads were dangerous, and long-distance commerce had all but collapsed since Rome's fall. Most goods were produced locally, with only occasional markets drawing merchants from nearby regions. Coinage was rare, and bartering remained the primary means of exchange. However, as feudal Europe stabilized, towns and trade began to grow once more. By the High Middle Ages, bustling market towns would emerge, linking manorial estates to a wider world of commerce. But for now, the economy remained deeply tied to land and labor. Wealth was measured in acres, not gold. A noble's power depended on how many peasants worked his fields and how many knights he could summon to defend them. It was a world where the rhythms of life were dictated by the demands of survival, where war, faith, and toil were inseparable. Feudalism was not just a system, it was the very fabric of medieval society. It dictated who ruled and who served, who fought and who toiled. For the people of the early medieval period, it provided order in an otherwise chaotic world. But even the strongest systems are not immune to change. Forces like population growth, urbanization, and the ambitions of kings began to shake its foundations. One of these forces was a Frankish king whose ambition would reshape Europe: Charlemagne. In the late 8th century, as feudalism's foundations wavered, the Franks rose as a formidable force under Charlemagne, a warrior, statesman, and visionary. His rule marked the first great attempt to unify Western Europe since Rome's fall, laying the groundwork for an empire that would define the medieval world. Charlemagne's rise was swift and decisive. When he ascended the throne of the Frankish kingdom in 768, he inherited a realm already strengthened by his father, Pepin the Short. But Charlemagne was not content with merely ruling. He sought to expand, to consolidate, and to bring order to the turbulent lands around him. His campaigns were relentless. From the Lombards of Italy to the Saxons of the north, he waged war after war, forging a vast empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. By the time his conquests were complete, he had built the most powerful state in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. Yet his ambitions went far beyond military conquest. Charlemagne was not just a warrior king, he was a ruler who understood that an empire could not be held together by the sword alone. And so, he turned his attention to the very fabric of his realm, its governance, its laws, and its people. He reorganized his administration, ensuring that his vast territories were governed with efficiency. He introduced a system of counts and local officials, each tasked with overseeing their regions while remaining loyal to the crown. He established the Missi Dominici, royal envoys who traveled throughout the empire to ensure that justice was upheld, that corruption was kept in check, and that his decrees were followed. But Charlemagne's vision extended even further. He recognized that true power did not come from military might alone. It came from knowledge. He saw the intellectual stagnation of Europe, the decline of learning, and the loss of ancient wisdom, and he sought to change it. In a time when literacy had become the privilege of the few, he championed education for the many. He gathered the greatest scholars of his time, inviting them to his court at Aachen, where they would lay the groundwork for a cultural and intellectual revival. This movement, known as the Carolingian Renaissance, was unlike anything Europe had seen for centuries. Under Charlemagne's rule, schools were established in monasteries and churches, ensuring that learning was no longer confined to the nobility. Latin, the language of Rome, was revived, preserved, and standardized. Ancient texts, many of which had been nearly lost to time, were copied and safeguarded by scribes working tirelessly in dimly lit scriptoria. Grammar, rhetoric, logic, and mathematics were once again studied, not just as relics of the past, but as tools for the future. But perhaps one of Charlemagne's most profound contributions was his reform of the legal system. He sought to bring order to a world where justice was often arbitrary and law varied from region to region. His legal reforms attempted to blend Roman law with Germanic traditions, creating a more structured and uniform system. He issued capitularies, royal decrees that provided clear rules on governance, justice, and the responsibilities of both rulers and subjects. And then, in the year 800, something happened that cemented Charlemagne's place in history. On Christmas Day, inside the grand halls of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, he knelt before Pope Leo III. As the congregation watched in hushed anticipation, the Pope placed a golden crown upon Charlemagne's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. At that moment, the Holy Roman Empire was born, not as a direct continuation of the fallen Western Roman Empire, but as its spiritual and political successor. It was a declaration that Europe had not forgotten its past, that despite the darkness of the previous centuries, Rome's legacy still endured. The coronation was more than just a ceremony. It was a statement. It signified the fusion of three great traditions: the Roman legacy, the Germanic warrior culture, and the Christian faith. It reinforced the idea that Europe was not just a collection of fractured kingdoms, but a civilization with a shared destiny. Yet, it also set the stage for centuries of power struggles between kings and popes, between the throne and the church, a conflict that shaped the course of medieval history. Charlemagne's reign was a turning point. His empire, though vast, did not last forever. After his death in 814, his successors struggled to maintain the unity he had built. The empire was eventually divided among his grandsons, fracturing into what later became France, Germany, and Italy. The dream of a united Christendom governed by a single ruler faded into history. But his legacy endured. His efforts to revive learning influenced future generations, preserving knowledge that might have otherwise been lost. His legal and administrative reforms set a precedent for governance in medieval Europe. His coronation as emperor established a tradition that persisted for nearly 1,000 years, with the Holy Roman Empire remaining a powerful force well into the Renaissance. And so, even as the Carolingian Empire faded, its impact could not be erased. The seeds that Charlemagne planted, his commitment to unity, learning, and governance, continued to shape the world long after his empire was gone. Europe had changed. The echoes of Rome had been revived, and though the continent was still centuries away from its next great awakening, the groundwork had been laid. Because history does not move in a straight line. It shifts, it breaks, it rebuilds. And Charlemagne, the warrior king, the scholar emperor, was one of those rare figures who stood at the crossroads of time, forging a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval age. His empire did not last, but his vision, a vision of a unified, learned, and powerful Europe, resonated through the ages, shaping the very foundations of the world to come. But unity was fragile, and as the Carolingian world splintered, it became vulnerable. In this moment of weakness, a new threat rose from the north, unlike anything Europe had faced before. From the icy fjords of the north came a force unlike any other, a people whose arrival would shake the foundations of Europe itself. Something was coming. And when it arrived, Europe would never be the same. The Vikings had arrived. The world of medieval Europe trembled at the sound of oars striking water in perfect unison. The sight of sleek, dragon-headed longships gliding through the mist sent waves of terror through coastal villages and monasteries alike. The Norsemen had come, not as emissaries, not as traders, but as raiders, warriors, and conquerors. Their arrival would shatter kingdoms, reshape the balance of power, and force an evolution in how Europe defended itself. For the next 3 centuries, the Vikings would carve their names into history with axe, fire, and iron. But these men were far more than mere plunderers. They were explorers, reaching lands that no European had ever seen. They were shrewd merchants, opening trade routes that connected east and west. And in time, they were kings and rulers, building dynasties that would outlast even their greatest war bands. Yet their impact was not just one of conquest and destruction. Their arrival marked one of the most defining struggles of the Dark Ages, forcing a fractured Europe to respond with stronger defenses, more centralized rule, and a shift in how power itself was structured. The Viking Age was not just a footnote in history, it was one of the most significant forces that shaped medieval Europe, accelerating the evolution of feudalism, warfare, and trade at a time when the continent was already reeling from the collapse of Rome. What had driven these men from the icy fjords of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark? The answer lay in their very way of life. The Viking world was one of constant struggle, fierce winters, scarce farmland, and an ever-growing population that put pressure on available resources. For younger sons without inheritance, for ambitious chieftains seeking glory, there was only one path forward: the sea. The longship was their key to the world. These masterfully crafted vessels could travel across stormy oceans and glide up the narrowest rivers, striking without warning, disappearing before any defense could be mounted. Their unmatched naval capabilities allowed them to raid deep into the heart of Europe, bypassing traditional fortifications and forcing entire kingdoms to rethink their military strategies. But survival alone was not their only motivation. The Vikings were a warrior culture, their gods demanding courage, battle, and victory. To die in bed was a fate of dishonor. To die with a sword in hand meant a place in Valhalla, the great hall of Odin. This belief shaped their fearless approach to battle. They fought with ferocity and discipline, favoring hit-and-run tactics that left their enemies scrambling. But beyond the battlefield, they also thrived on trade, connecting Scandinavia, the British Isles, the Frankish Empire, the Byzantine world, and even the distant markets of the Islamic caliphates. Their expansion was as much economic as it was military, embedding them deeply into the fabric of medieval Europe. Their first major target was England. In 793, a fleet descended upon Lindisfarne, a wealthy island monastery. The monks were slaughtered or taken as thralls, and the gold and silver relics that adorned the altar were stripped away. To the Christian world, it was an unspeakable horror, an attack on the very heart of their faith. To the Vikings, it was only the beginning. The Dark Ages had already plunged much of Europe into a chaotic world where warlords ruled fragmented territories, and the Vikings thrived in this disorder. The lack of strong, centralized power meant that no army could swiftly come to the aid of those under attack. It was a world primed for raiders, and the Norsemen exploited it mercilessly. By the middle of the 9th century, Viking raids had evolved into something far more dangerous. This was no longer about plundering and vanishing into the mist. This was a full-scale invasion. In 865, a force known as the Great Heathen Army landed on English shores. Unlike earlier raids, this was an organized war effort led by some of the most legendary Viking warriors in history. At the head of the army stood Ivar the Boneless, a warlord whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Stories differ on the origin of his nickname. Some say he suffered from a condition that left him unable to walk, forcing him to be carried into battle. But if his legs were weak, his mind was unmatched. Ivar was a master strategist, a man who turned his supposed weakness into a source of terrifying unpredictability. He fought alongside his brothers Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ubba, sons of the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok, whose death at the hands of the Northumbrian king had fueled their thirst for revenge. The Vikings swept across England, capturing the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia. Only Wessex, ruled by King Alfred the Great, resisted. The war was brutal, with Viking warbands burning cities, slaying kings, and carving up England into Norse territories. By the time peace was made, vast portions of England were under Viking control, a land known as the Danelaw, where Norse laws, customs, and even language took root. This was not merely a military conquest, it was a transformation of English society. The Dark Ages had already been defined by shifting allegiances and fractured rule, and the Viking presence further complicated the already fragile balance of power. Their settlements forced rulers to rethink governance, fortifications, and diplomacy, accelerating the very feudal structures that had begun taking shape. While England burned, the Vikings turned their gaze south. The Frankish Empire, once ruled by Charlemagne, was fractured and weak. It was the perfect target. In 845, the legendary chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok himself led a fleet of 120 ships and 5,000 men up the Seine River, sacking towns as they went. When they reached Paris, the city fell into chaos. The Viking warbands plundered everything in sight, forcing the Frankish king Charles the Bald to pay a massive ransom to make them leave. But this was only the beginning. By the end of the 9th century, Viking warbands were wintering in France, no longer just raiding, but settling. In 911, one of the most famous Viking leaders, Rollo, was granted land by King Charles in exchange for protection against future Norse attacks. This land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. These Vikings turned lords became deeply woven into European nobility, their descendants eventually launching the Norman conquest of England in 1066, a pivotal moment in medieval history. The political shifts triggered by these Viking incursions further cemented feudalism, forcing kings to grant land to powerful warlords in exchange for loyalty and military service. The very essence of Dark Age rule, where power was decentralized and military might dictated survival, was reinforced by the Viking invasions. But while the Western Vikings were building new kingdoms, another Norse force was rising in the east. The Varangians, Viking warriors from Sweden, followed the great rivers of Russia and Ukraine, reaching as far as the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. They were known for their ruthlessness, but also for their skill as merchants. They established vast trade routes linking Scandinavia to Constantinople and the Islamic caliphates. One of their greatest legacies was the founding of Kievan Rus, the early Russian state. In the 9th century, the Viking chieftain Rurik took control of Novgorod, and his successors established rule over Kiev, creating a powerful kingdom that would last for centuries. By the late 11th century, the Viking Age was drawing to a close. The very kingdoms they had raided had grown stronger. England had unified, France had fortified its cities, and the Holy Roman Empire had emerged as a dominant force in Europe. The very invasions that had terrorized these lands had forced medieval Europe to adapt, strengthening the feudal system, increasing military professionalism, and fortifying cities like never before. The Viking Age, while often seen as a time of destruction, was just as much a catalyst for the transformation of the Dark Ages into the medieval world to come. Though their longships no longer sailed the rivers of Europe, their legacy remained, woven into the very fabric of the kingdoms that had risen to fight them. While the Viking Age waned in the 11th century, the Islamic world had already been shaping civilization for centuries, not through war and conquest alone, but through a deep devotion to knowledge, culture, and progress. As Europe grappled with feudal strife, famine, and the ruins of a fragmented post-Roman world, cities like Baghdad and Cordoba stood as beacons of light. An empire of learning and innovation had flourished, preserving the wisdom of the ancients while forging new paths in science, philosophy, and art. While Europe remained fractured and inward-looking, the Islamic world reached across continents, connecting cultures through scholarship, trade, and dialogue. This flourishing did not emerge in a vacuum. Its roots stretched back to the 8th century when the Abbasid Caliphate rose to power. After seizing control in 750 AD, the Abbasids moved the capital to Baghdad and ushered in a golden age of intellectual awakening. At the heart of this movement stood the legendary House of Wisdom, an extraordinary institution where scholars from all backgrounds came together to translate, study, and expand upon the knowledge of Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. In an age when much of Europe struggled to preserve even the remnants of literacy, Baghdad had become the beating heart of global thought. Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, Persian science, and Indian mathematics all found new life within the walls of the House of Wisdom. Scholars eagerly translated texts from Greek and Latin into Arabic, ensuring that the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Hippocrates were not lost to time. It was here that Euclid's geometry, Galen's medical theories, and Ptolemy's astronomy were not only preserved but expanded upon. But the scholars of the Islamic world were not content with mere preservation. They built upon this knowledge, testing ideas, conducting experiments, and refining theories in ways that shaped the course of human history. The Persian scholar Al-Khwarizmi, working in the 9th century, revolutionized mathematics by developing algebra, a term derived from his book Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. His work laid the foundation for modern equations and calculations, influencing both the Islamic world and later European mathematics. The renowned physician Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, compiled the Canon of Medicine, a groundbreaking medical encyclopedia studied in Europe for centuries. He advanced the understanding of contagious diseases, mental health, and surgical techniques, setting standards that remained relevant well into the Renaissance. Observatories in Baghdad and Damascus refined the ancient Greek models of the cosmos. The scholar al-Battani made precise calculations of the solar year, while others corrected Ptolemy's geocentric model, paving the way for future discoveries about planetary motion. While monks in medieval Europe struggled to copy old Latin texts, these scholars created new fields of study, advancing medicine, mathematics, and astronomy to heights unseen since the time of the Romans. The Islamic Golden Age was not just an era of scientific advancement, it was a period of extraordinary cultural and artistic growth. While much of Europe remained architecturally stagnant, the Islamic world saw the rise of breathtaking cities. Architecture flourished with the construction of the Alhambra in Spain, the Great Mosque of Cordoba, and the magnificent Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, buildings that combined mathematical precision with intricate artistry. Literature thrived as poets like Rumi and al-Mutanabi explored themes of love, philosophy, and mysticism, while storytellers compiled fables and legends into works like 1001 Nights, a collection that later influenced European literature. Engineering advanced as Islamic inventors built sophisticated water clocks, irrigation systems, and even rudimentary flying machines, centuries before Leonardo da Vinci's sketches of flight. All of this was made possible by a society that valued knowledge and encouraged intellectual pursuit. Unlike in Europe, Where learning was largely confined to monasteries, education in the Islamic world was more accessible. Great libraries in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, ensuring that ideas could spread freely and inspire new generations of scholars. Despite the stark differences in their intellectual and cultural development, the Islamic world and medieval Europe were not entirely isolated from one another. Their histories were deeply intertwined, sometimes through conflict, but often through exchange. Islamic merchants dominated trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to China. Goods, ideas, and knowledge flowed between the Islamic world and Europe, carried by traders, scholars, and diplomats. While many in Europe remained ignorant of the advancements being made in the East, those who traveled, such as Christian monks and Jewish scholars, often returned with valuable knowledge. Even warfare became an unlikely conduit for exchange. In the 11th century, military campaigns launched by Christian Europe to reclaim the Holy Land brought knights and scholars into direct contact with the Islamic world. Though the Crusades were driven by religious fervor, they inadvertently bridged cultures. Europeans returned with more than relics. They carried advanced medical practices, architectural techniques, and technologies that would seed future transformations in the West. Nowhere was this exchange more evident than in Al-Andalus, the Islamic-controlled regions of Spain. Cities like Cordoba and Toledo became vibrant centers of learning, where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked together to translate texts from Arabic into Latin. In these cities, Europe rediscovered the lost works of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen, texts that later sparked the intellectual revival of the Renaissance. By the 12th and 13th centuries, a shift began. The knowledge preserved and expanded upon by the Islamic world gradually made its way into European universities. The medical treatises of Ibn Sina, the astronomical calculations of al-Battani, and the mathematical foundations of al-Khwarizmi became fundamental parts of European education. This slow intellectual awakening, often referred to as the 12th century Renaissance, marked the first true steps toward Europe's recovery. Universities were established in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, where scholars studied texts preserved in the Islamic world. The rigid theological focus of medieval Europe began to make room for reason, science, and philosophy. As the Islamic Golden Age continued to thrive, Europe stood on the brink of transformation. The intellectual darkness that had overshadowed the continent for centuries finally lifted. Long-buried ideas resurfaced, setting the stage for the great intellectual movements to come. This marked the beginning of a new chapter. The rise of scholasticism, the rediscovery of ancient texts, and the growing influence of Islamic knowledge propelled Europe into a new era, leading to the dawn of the Renaissance. As history continued to unfold, Europe stood poised to embrace an age of enlightenment, where the echoes of the past shaped the future in ways that no one yet foresaw. Yet, while the Islamic world blazed a trail of intellectual brilliance and Europe began to awaken, there was one civilization that never truly succumbed to the darkness of the Middle Ages. In the East, the Byzantine Empire stood resilient, not as a relic of the past, but as the living continuation of Rome. With its golden capital at Constantinople, Byzantium carried the legacy of Caesar and Augustus into the medieval world. It was a world not defined by forgotten ruins or lost knowledge, but by resilience, adaptation, and imperial ambition. As Western Europe crumbled and the Islamic caliphates flourished, the Byzantines held firm, guarding Roman tradition and bridging the gap between ancient glory and the evolving world. While Europe struggled to reclaim lost knowledge, the Byzantine Empire never allowed it to fade. In the East, Byzantium stood as the last great heir to Rome, preserving and adapting its legacy. Despite the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Byzantium endured, not merely as a survivor, but as a beacon of continuity and resilience. Holding fast to Roman law, governance, and culture, the Byzantines navigated a changing world. From the golden domes of Constantinople to the formidable strength of its armies, Byzantium carried the essence of Rome into a new age, refined, transformed, yet unmistakably Roman at its core. Byzantium's survival amidst the collapse of the Western Roman Empire is nothing short of remarkable. The fall of Rome in 476 AD had left Europe in disarray, with the barbarians flooding in and dismantling much of what remained of the once mighty empire. However, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered around Constantinople, weathered these storms. It was as if the very foundations of Rome had been scattered across the Mediterranean and the East, waiting to be gathered together under the banner of a new yet familiar power. For over 1,000 years after the fall of the West, Byzantium held the flame of Roman tradition, even though the West had long since forgotten it. But how did Byzantium manage to survive the fall of Rome? The answer lies in a mix of strategic geographic location, political savvy, and military strength. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was situated on the crossroads of Europe and Asia, making it incredibly difficult for invaders to penetrate. The city sat on a peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides, providing an unparalleled natural defense. Yet, it was not just geography that preserved Byzantium. It was the empire's ability to adapt. Byzantium's leaders were keenly aware that the world was changing, and they embraced the new realities while preserving the core elements of Roman governance, law, and culture. The Byzantines kept the Roman Senate and the concept of imperial authority, but they also incorporated Eastern philosophies, including Christianity, which played a vital role in unifying the empire under a common belief system. In the midst of this transformation, one man rose to become the embodiment of the Byzantine Empire's strength and resilience: Emperor Justinian. His reign, from 527 to 565, marked a high point in Byzantine history. Justinian was not only a capable leader, he was a visionary. He sought to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory, taking it upon himself to reconquer lost territories and consolidate Byzantine power in the Mediterranean. His ambitious campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and Spain aimed to reclaim the lands once lost to the barbarians. Though not all his efforts succeeded in the long run, they briefly restored a sense of Roman unity to the Western world. Justinian's greatest legacy, however, did not lie in his military campaigns, but in his impact on law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, stood as a monumental achievement, a codification of Roman law that influenced European legal systems for centuries. This compilation preserved Roman legal thought while modernizing it for the needs of the Byzantine Empire. Justinian's laws reached deep into society, affecting everything from property rights to marriage, forming the foundation for many of the legal systems that later shaped medieval Europe. In this way, Justinian's legacy was not only one of conquest, but of intellectual preservation and progressive reform. But Justinian's accomplishments were not achieved alone. His wife, Empress Theodora, played an equally critical role in the empire's success. Theodora was a woman of incredible strength, intelligence, and political acumen. Before becoming empress, Theodora had been an actress and dancer, a background that made her an unlikely candidate for the wife of the emperor. Yet, she was not just a figurehead. She was Justinian's most trusted advisor and a formidable force in her own right. Together, Justinian and Theodora worked to rebuild the empire. Theodora's influence can be seen in numerous reforms, including those that improved the legal standing of women in Byzantine society. She pushed for laws that protected women from forced marriages and granted them the right to own property. Theodora also played a crucial role in dealing with the Nika riots in 532 AD. When protests erupted in Constantinople, threatening to overthrow Justinian's rule, it was Theodora's unwavering resolve that kept the emperor in power. Her famous words, "Purple is a good color for a king," referring to the royal color of the Byzantine Empire, urged Justinian to stay and fight, ultimately quelling the rebellion and solidifying their rule. As Justinian and Theodora worked to rebuild the empire, the Byzantine Empire continued to thrive in many ways. It became a center of art, culture, and learning. Byzantine art, with its intricate mosaics and icons, became a defining feature of the empire's identity, while its architecture, especially the Hagia Sophia, stood as a testament to its grandeur. The Byzantine Empire was also known for its exceptional military power. The Byzantine army was one of the most disciplined and well-trained forces in the medieval world. The empire's use of Greek fire, a powerful incendiary weapon, gave the Byzantines a tactical edge in naval warfare, and their use of heavily armored cavalry known as cataphracts made them a formidable presence on land. But perhaps the greatest impact the Byzantine Empire had on medieval Europe was its preservation of knowledge. As Europe entered a period of intellectual darkness, Byzantium remained a beacon of learning. The Byzantine Empire maintained libraries filled with ancient texts, many of which the West lost during the chaos of the Dark Ages. Scholars in Constantinople continued to study the works of Greek and Roman philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists, preserving knowledge that helped reignite Europe's intellectual revival during the Renaissance. The Byzantines also played a central role in preserving Christian theology and spreading it to the Slavic world, converting many Slavic peoples to Christianity and introducing them to the rich cultural and intellectual traditions of the Byzantine Empire. While the Byzantine Empire's military power, culture, and intellectual achievements were significant, the empire faced constant challenges. It was constantly under threat from external forces, most notably from the Persians, Arabs, and later, the Ottoman Turks. Internally, the empire struggled with political instability and religious conflicts, particularly over the role of the Eastern Orthodox Church in society. These challenges weakened the empire over time, but for many centuries, Byzantium managed to hold its ground and continue its legacy. However, the empire's final days were marked by the rise of new powers. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Byzantine Empire was weakened by internal strife and the relentless expansion of the Ottoman Turks. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 extinguished the last flicker of Roman political power. Yet Byzantium's true legacy lay not in territory, but in culture. Its preservation of Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology would soon fuel Europe's intellectual rebirth. As Byzantium faded, Europe began to stir. The Islamic Golden Age still thrived, advancing science and trade, but the West, armed with Byzantine-preserved texts, awakened to new ideas. Universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford blended ancient wisdom with Islamic innovations, while Byzantine art and architecture seeped into Europe's cultural fabric. The Renaissance, often remembered for rediscovering antiquity, owed its spark to scribes in Constantinople, translators in Toledo, and scholars in Florence. Byzantium's flame had dimmed, but its light endured. The rigid theology of the Middle Ages gave way to reason and inquiry. The rediscovery of Aristotle's logic, Galen's medicine, and Justinian's legal codes, all safeguarded by Byzantium, ignited revolutions in art, science, and governance. This was no sudden dawn, but a slow burn kindled by centuries of exchange. Yet Europe's path to rebirth was neither straight nor peaceful. Long before its revival, the continent had endured a trial that began as Rome's empire crumbled. Across the vast, wind-swept steppes of Eurasia, nomadic warriors shaped the fate of civilizations. They were the specters of the East, unstoppable, elusive, and feared beyond measure. In the 4th and 5th centuries, their migrations and conquests dictated the course of history, descending upon Europe to alter its destiny. The first of these steppe warriors to carve their names into the annals of history were the Huns. Emerging from the grasslands of Central Asia, their approach sent shockwaves through the Western world by the late 4th century. To Romans and Germanic tribes alike, the Huns were not mere warriors. They were a force of nature, merciless, unyielding, and utterly foreign. Their warfare defied European conventions. With short, powerful, recurved bows, they unleashed volleys of arrows at full gallop, striking before enemies knew they were under attack. Their endurance-bred horses carried them across vast distances, enabling raids that left kingdoms reeling. And in the 5th century, at the head of this storm stood Attila the Hun, a man whose name embodied fear itself. Until his death in 453 AD, Attila waged war against both Roman empires. He ravaged the Balkans, plundered cities, and extorted gold from Constantinople. When Rome refused to submit, he marched into Gaul in 451 AD, clashing with a Roman-Germanic coalition at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Though forced to retreat, his legend grew, a harbinger of apocalypse. The following year, he turned to Italy, reaching the gates of Rome itself. Pope Leo I met Attila and persuaded him to withdraw, a moment shrouded in mystery. Fate intervened again in 453 AD. Attila died suddenly on his wedding night, his empire unraveling within months. Without their leader, the Huns scattered, their once mighty horde dissolving into legend. Yet the fall of the Huns did not bring peace to Europe. If anything, their arrival set a dangerous precedent, revealing the vulnerabilities of the continent and inspiring new waves of invaders to follow. In the centuries that followed, two more steppe peoples, the Avars and the Magyars, emerged from the east, each leaving their own mark on the medieval world. The Avars, like the Huns before them, were a nomadic people from the heart of the Eurasian steppe. By the mid-6th century, they had pushed into Eastern Europe, establishing a powerful confederation that extended across the Carpathian Basin. They were master horsemen and skilled warriors, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies with their lightning-fast raids. For over 2 centuries, the Avar Khaganate was one of the dominant forces in Central Europe, challenging both the Byzantine Empire and the emerging Frankish kingdom. Under their leadership, the Avars led relentless attacks on the Balkans, besieging Constantinople itself in 626 AD. Though they failed to capture the city, their presence remained a constant threat, forcing Byzantium to divert resources toward defending its borders. They introduced new tactics to European warfare, including the widespread use of stirrup technology, which allowed cavalry to fight with greater stability and control, forever changing the nature of mounted combat in the medieval world. But like all great nomadic empires, the Avar Khaganate was not destined to last. By the late 8th century, the Frankish king Charlemagne launched a brutal campaign to crush the Avars, dismantling their strongholds and seizing their immense wealth. The once mighty Avars faded into obscurity, absorbed by the Slavic and Germanic peoples of the region. Yet even as the Avars disappeared, another wave of horsemen was already on the horizon. In the 9th century, the Magyars, a fierce people from the Ural Mountains, began their own march westward. Unlike the Huns and the Avars before them, the Magyars were not mere raiders. They were conquerors. With a blend of cunning strategy and devastating speed, the Magyars launched a series of ruthless campaigns across Central and Western Europe. Their hit-and-run tactics baffled European armies as they struck deep into enemy territory before vanishing into the night. They rode across Germany, Italy, and even into France, leaving destruction in their wake. For nearly 50 years, no kingdom in Europe was safe from their attacks. By the early 10th century, however, their fortunes began to change. At the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD, the Magyars suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Otto the Great, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a turning point in their history. Recognizing that their days as nomadic raiders were over, the Magyars did something that few steppe peoples before them had managed. They adapted. Under their leader, Grand Prince Geza, they began a process of settling in the Carpathian Basin, adopting Christianity, and laying the foundations for what would become the Kingdom of Hungary. Unlike the Huns and Avars, whose legacies were mostly written in the ashes of their conquests, the Magyars endured, transforming from fearsome invaders into a lasting European power. Their eventual Christianization under King Stephen the Byrnc in the year 1000 marked the final stage of their transformation. No longer nomads, they built cities, established laws, and integrated into the broader fabric of medieval Europe. Yet, even as they settled, the echoes of their warrior past remained. The Magyars had proven that the steppe horsemen, once the terror of Europe, could become part of the very world they had once sought to conquer. The invasions of the Huns, Avars, and Magyars reshaped the medieval world in profound ways. They tested the resilience of European kingdoms, forced military innovations, and redrew the map of the continent. The scars of their conquests were written in the ruins of burned villages and abandoned fortresses, yet their influence endured in ways that stretched far beyond the battlefield. But from the ashes of destruction, something new was emerging. As the chaos of nomadic invasions faded, a new power was rising in the east, one that would carve its own path through medieval history. In the dense forests and rolling plains beyond the Carpathian Mountains, Slavic tribes had long existed in fragmented communities, caught between the empires that surrounded them. Yet in this period of transition, they began to forge something greater, from scattered tribes, mighty kingdoms would rise, shaping the future of Eastern Europe in ways few could have predicted. Now, the story of medieval Europe would take a new turn, not one of conquest and destruction, but of state-building, faith, and identity. This is the story of the Slavic and Eastern European kingdoms, how they rose from obscurity to become the beating heart of the medieval East. In the dense forests and vast river valleys beyond the Carpathian Mountains, the Slavs, once a scattered collection of tribal communities, were on the cusp of transformation. These were people who had long been overshadowed by the great empires of the West and the nomadic warriors of the East. Yet in the centuries that followed, they would carve their own path, giving rise to mighty kingdoms that would shape the course of medieval Eastern Europe. Unlike the Franks or the Byzantines, the Slavs had no ancient imperial legacy to draw from, no grand cities left behind by Rome. Instead, they were bound together by language, custom, and a deep connection to the land they inhabited. For centuries, they had lived as fragmented tribes, subsisting in isolated villages, their societies built around kinship and tradition. But as the dust of invasion settled, something remarkable began to happen. The Slavic world, once decentralized and divided, started to coalesce. Small tribal groups expanded into larger chiefdoms, and eventually, powerful states emerged: Poland, Bulgaria, and most notably, Kievan Rus. At the heart of this transformation was trade. The rivers of Eastern Europe, the Dnieper, the Vistula, the Danube, became lifelines, carrying merchants, warriors, and settlers between the Baltic and the Black Sea. And where trade flourished, power followed. Along these waterways, new cities began to rise, acting as centers of commerce and governance. But for these emerging Slavic states to truly establish themselves, they needed more than just wealth. They needed unity, leadership, and above all, faith. It was in this landscape that one of the most pivotal figures of the early medieval East emerged: Rurik, a Varangian warrior whose legacy laid the foundation for the most powerful Slavic state of the era, Kievan Rus. The origins of Rurik remain shrouded in legend, but according to the chronicles of the time, he was a Norse chieftain invited by the Slavs to bring order to their lands. Whether he arrived as a conqueror or a ruler by invitation, one thing was certain: his dynasty changed history. Under Rurik and his successors, Kievan Rus flourished, becoming the dominant power of Eastern Europe. The great city of Kiev, nestled along the banks of the Dnieper River, grew into a thriving hub of trade, its markets filled with furs, honey, and silver. From the north, goods flowed in from the Viking lands of Scandinavia. From the south, traders brought silks and spices from Byzantium. The kingdom became a crossroads of civilizations, and its rulers quickly recognized that power came not only through conquest, but through diplomacy and faith. This realization led to one of the most defining moments in Slavic history, the Christianization of Kievan Rus. And at the center of this transformation stood one man, Vladimir the Great. Vladimir, a descendant of Rurik, had come to power through blood and steel, securing his throne through ruthless ambition. But despite his military success, he understood that true stability required more than warfare. The pagan traditions of the Slavs, while deeply ingrained, did not offer the unifying force needed to solidify his rule. And so, Vladimir sought a faith that could bring legitimacy, order, and prestige to his kingdom. The choice was not a simple one. Islam had spread across vast regions, and the Islamic caliphates wielded immense power. Catholicism, under the authority of Rome, held sway in the West. But it was Byzantine Christianity that ultimately captivated Vladimir. According to legend, when his envoys visited Constantinople, they were struck by the grandeur of the Hagia Sophia, declaring that they knew not whether they were in heaven or on earth. In the year 988, Vladimir made his decision. He embraced Orthodox Christianity and ordered the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River. This moment was more than just a religious conversion, it was a declaration of alignment. By choosing Byzantine Christianity, Kievan Rus entered the sphere of Eastern Orthodox influence, drawing it closer to the cultural and political orbit of Constantinople. Art, architecture, and literature flourished in Kiev as Byzantine traditions took root, and the kingdom cemented itself as a bridge between the Slavic world and the legacy of Rome. Yet Kievan Rus was not the only Slavic power on the rise. To the south, in the rugged lands of the Balkans, another great kingdom was taking shape, the First Bulgarian Empire. Bulgaria's origins trace back to the late 7th century, when the Bulgar tribes, a Turkic people from the steppes, merged with the local Slavic population to form a powerful state. Under the rule of Khan Krum and later Tsar Simeon the Great, Bulgaria became a dominant force in southeastern Europe, clashing with the Byzantines in fierce battles for supremacy. Like Kievan Rus, Bulgaria faced a defining question: what faith would shape its destiny? The answer came in 865, when Boris I of Bulgaria accepted Christianity, aligning his realm with Byzantine orthodoxy. But Bulgaria went a step further, playing a crucial role in shaping Slavic identity through language. It was within the walls of Bulgarian monasteries that the Cyrillic alphabet was born, crafted by the disciples of Saints Cyril and Methodius. This new script allowed Slavic peoples to write their own histories, their own laws, and their own religious texts, forever breaking the monopoly of Latin and Greek. Meanwhile, to the west, another Slavic kingdom was forging its own path: Poland. Unlike Kievan Rus and Bulgaria, which gravitated toward Byzantium, Poland looked to the Catholic Church in Rome. The decisive moment came in 966, when Mieszko I, ruler of the Polans, embraced Christianity under the Latin Rite. This act not only secured Poland's place within the Western European sphere, but also laid the groundwork for a centralized monarchy. Over the coming centuries, Poland became a stronghold of Catholicism, its rulers navigating the delicate balance between East and West. But even as these Slavic states took shape, they were not alone in their ambitions. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, was not yet finished. And in the late 10th century, a ruler emerged who reminded the world of its enduring strength: Basil II, the Bulgar slayer. Basil II was not just a warrior, he was a strategist of the highest order. Determined to reclaim Byzantine dominance, he launched a brutal campaign against Bulgaria, crushing the empire in 1018 and reasserting imperial authority over the Balkans. His victory was legendary. After one decisive battle, he ordered thousands of captured Bulgarian soldiers to be blinded, leaving only one in every 100 with a single eye to guide the others back to their homeland. The message was clear: Byzantium was still a force to be reckoned with. Yet, despite the might of emperors and the ambitions of kings, it was faith that had left the deepest mark on Eastern Europe. Christianity had transformed the Slavic world, binding nations together through shared beliefs and cultural traditions. The conversion of Kievan Rus had brought the Slavs into the fold of Orthodox Christianity. Bulgaria had given them a written language, and Poland had secured its place within the Western Catholic sphere. The Slavic world was no longer a collection of scattered tribes. It had become a tapestry of powerful states, each with its own identity, yet bound by a common heritage. But history never stands still. Even as these new kingdoms rose to power, the world remained an unforgiving place. War, disease, and famine loomed over medieval society, testing the resilience of both rulers and common folk alike. The rise of new kingdoms was only part of the story. The struggle to survive in a world marked by hardship was just as defining. And in the centuries to come, Europe faced some of its darkest trials yet. For all the battles fought with swords and shields, the most merciless enemies of the medieval world were those that could not be seen. They came without warning, creeping through cities and villages, striking the mighty and the meek alike. They arrived in the belly of rats, in the spoiled grains of a poor harvest, in the cruel winds of an unforgiving winter. Plague, famine, hardship. These were the forces that shaped the lives of millions more than any king or conqueror ever could. The first great wave of death came not from war, but from a silent killer. It swept across the Byzantine Empire at the height of its glory, turning one of the world's most powerful civilizations into a city of corpses. Some called it a divine curse, others an apocalyptic reckoning, but history remembers it by another name: the Justinian Plague. No one knew exactly where it had begun. Some whispered of its origins in the grain ships of Egypt, where fleas carried the invisible death into the great Mediterranean ports. Others believed it had always been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What is certain is that when it reached Constantinople in the year 541, it showed no mercy. It began quietly, like a shadow creeping through the streets. A fever, a swelling beneath the skin, a sudden weakness in the limbs. Then came the blackened sores, the violent chills, the delirium. Once infected, death often came within days. And in the heart of the empire, the numbers were staggering. At its peak, the plague claimed the lives of thousands every day, bodies piled in alleyways, rotting in the sun. The stench of death clung to the city like a curse. There were not enough hands to bury the dead, nor enough prayers to make sense of the devastation. Even Emperor Justinian himself fell ill, though he miraculously survived. But the world he awoke to was a broken one. The streets of Constantinople, once filled with merchants and scholars, were now eerily silent. Trade collapsed, the economy crumbled, entire villages were abandoned, their fields left to wither under an empty sky. And as the empire struggled to recover, the plague didn't simply vanish, it lingered, returning in waves over the next 2 centuries, each time leaving death in its wake. And yet, disease was only one of the great trials the medieval world endured, for even those who escaped the plague found themselves at the mercy of another, slower kind of death, one that came not from sickness, but from starvation. Hunger was a constant shadow over medieval life. A single failed harvest could mean the difference between survival and ruin. But what happens when bad harvests come year after year? When the skies refuse to grant the warmth of the sun, when the rains drown the fields, when the earth itself seems to betray those who toil upon it. The early medieval period saw erratic shifts in climate, long winters, unrelenting storms, and bitter cold that choked the life from the land. Crops failed, livestock perished, grain stores emptied, and desperation took hold. In some regions, the famines lasted for months, in others, for years. The people called it the Long Hunger. In villages, families rationed what little they had, stretching meager portions of bread and broth as far as they could. But even the strongest could not endure forever. Starvation set in, first weakening the body, then consuming it from within. The old and the weak died first. The children were not far behind. Desperation drove some to unthinkable acts. There were whispers, chroniclers who wrote in hushed horror of villages where neighbors turned upon one another, where the unburied dead were not left to rot. In some places, the church declared days of fasting and penance, urging the people to repent for their sins, as if hunger itself were a punishment. But prayers did not fill bellies, and faith alone could not ward off starvation. Even the mighty suffered. Kings and lords waged wars, not just for land, but for food. Armies pillaged what little remained, taking grain, livestock, and anything of value. Peasants, already on the brink of collapse, were taxed beyond reason, forced to give up what little they had to those who already had more than enough. In the eyes of the suffering, the nobles lived in another world, one where banquets continued while villages starved, where gold could buy comfort while the poor wasted away in the streets. For the common people, life was a battle fought not with swords, but with the cruel realities of survival. Theirs was a world of endless toil, of waking before dawn to labor in the fields, of bending their backs to the plow until their hands were raw. Their homes were small and cold, their meals simple and meager. Meat was a rare luxury, bread a necessity, and hunger an old and familiar companion. Illness was always close behind. Even without great plagues, disease ran rampant in medieval villages. Water was often contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery that could sweep through a town in days. Simple infections were often fatal. Childbirth was a gamble, and many infants never lived to see their first year. Life expectancy was short, and death was never far. But despite the hardships, the people endured. They tilled their fields, they raised their families, they held fast to whatever hope they could find. Some found solace in faith, believing that their suffering was part of a greater divine plan. Others simply accepted the world as it was, harsh, unforgiving, but theirs to survive. And so the centuries passed. The Justinian Plague faded into history, leaving behind only scars and stories. The famines came and went, each one testing the resilience of those who lived through them. Hardship remained an unshakable truth of medieval life. By the 11th century, Europe had endured, but faith, once a refuge for the suffering, now turned outward. The Church summoned warriors to reclaim God's land, igniting a new fever. Holy war. The Crusades had begun. War had long been a part of medieval life. Kings clashed over thrones, lords feuded over land, and common men fought to protect their homes. But this war, this great call to arms, was different. It was not a battle for territory alone, nor for mere survival. It was a war of faith, of vengeance, of divine purpose. It carried men far beyond their homelands, across seas and scorching deserts, into lands they knew only in whispers, and it changed the course of history forever. The Crusades began with a promise. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a gathered crowd at Clermont, his voice ringing with urgency. He spoke of suffering, of Christian lands seized by the Seljuk Turks, of pilgrims harassed and holy sites defiled. But most of all, he spoke of a duty to reclaim what had been lost, to defend the faith, to march eastward and take back Jerusalem. His words burned through the crowd like wildfire. "Deus vult!" they cried. "God wills it!" And with that, the First Crusade was born. The call spread across Europe like a fever. Kings and noblemen took up the cross, eager for honor and divine favor. Peasants and beggars left their fields behind, believing they marched not just for a cause, but for the salvation of their souls. It was a war unlike any before it, one that drew together knights and commoners, emperors and outcasts under a single banner. Yet for all its grand ideals, the Crusades were not purely driven by faith. Ambition, greed, and the promise of wealth played their part. To many, the East was not just a land of holy sites, it was a land of opportunity. The first wave of Crusaders was not made up of disciplined warriors, but of desperate masses. Entire villages emptied as men, women, and children set off on foot toward the Holy Land, believing God would guide them. What followed was disaster. Lacking provisions and leadership, many starved before ever reaching their destination. Some, driven by desperation, turned to raiding and violence, attacking Jewish communities and plundering villages in their path. When the so-called People's Crusade finally reached Turkish lands, it was met with swift and merciless slaughter. Those who survived were either enslaved or left to wander, broken and forgotten. But the true knights of Christendom followed. The First Crusade, though marked by suffering and hardship, ultimately succeeded in its mission. In 1099, after years of bloodshed, the Crusaders stormed Jerusalem. What followed was a massacre. The streets of the Holy City ran red with blood as soldiers cut down men, women, and children alike. In their eyes, it was divine justice, a cleansing of the unbelievers. To the rest of the world, it was a horror beyond words, but for the victors, it was a triumph. The Crusader states took root, and for the first time in centuries, Christian rule returned to the Holy Land. Yet the Crusades didn't end with this victory. Far from it. The war for the Holy Land raged on for nearly 2 centuries, with each new generation answering the call. The Second Crusade, launched in the mid-12th century, ended in failure. The Third, led by the legendary Richard the Lionheart, brought fierce battles but no lasting conquest. Time and again, Christian and Muslim armies clashed, victories fleeting, losses heavy. Kings rose and fell, alliances formed and shattered, but Jerusalem stayed at the center of it all. And then came Saladin. The great Muslim leader, known not just for military brilliance but for his honor, turned the tide of the Crusades. In 1187, he reclaimed Jerusalem, defeating the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. Yet unlike the bloodbath of the First Crusade, Saladin's triumph carried a different legacy. He spared the city's inhabitants, allowing many to leave unharmed. A moment remembered in history, a stark contrast to the brutality that came before. The Crusades were not fought only in the Holy Land. Their spirit spread across Europe, igniting conflicts far and wide. In Spain, the Reconquista was driven by the same fervor as Christian kingdoms pushed back against Muslim rule. In the Baltic, knights waged war against pagan tribes in the name of the Church. Even within Christendom itself, the Crusades left their mark. The Fourth Crusade, originally meant to reclaim Jerusalem, instead turned against fellow Christians, leading to the infamous sack of Constantinople in 1204. The great Byzantine capital, a city of immense wealth and culture, was reduced to ruins by those who had once called themselves allies. In that moment, the Crusades betrayed their own cause, becoming less a holy war and more a struggle for power and plunder. Yet for all the blood spilled, the Crusades did not end in conquest. By the late 13th century, the last Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land fell. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem had faded, buried beneath centuries of warfare, but the impact of the Crusades reached far beyond their original purpose. They had reshaped the medieval world in ways no one had foreseen. The wars had opened Europe's eyes to a world beyond its borders. Crusaders returned not just with scars and stories, but with knowledge, goods, and ideas. They brought back spices and silk, unfamiliar medicines and scientific texts, sparking new curiosity and trade between East and West. The bustling markets of Venice and Genoa grew rich on the flow of goods from the Levant, laying the foundation for the rise of powerful merchant empires. The Crusades had also changed warfare. They had introduced new tactics, fortifications, and siege techniques, lessons learned through brutal experience. The great castles of Europe, with their towering walls and deadly defenses, owed much to the conflicts fought in the East. The bonds between kings and nobles shifted as well. The constant need for resources to fund these wars gave rise to new forms of taxation, strengthening the power of monarchs and changing the balance of medieval politics. But perhaps the greatest consequence of the Crusades was not military or economic, it was cultural. For centuries, Christians and Muslims clashed on the battlefield, yet in doing so, they also learned from one another. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of the ancient world, translating Greek and Roman texts long forgotten in the West. Through this exchange, though unintentional and often born of conflict, Europe rediscovered lost knowledge, planting the seeds of the Renaissance that emerged centuries later. Still, the Crusades left behind deep wounds. They solidified religious divisions, deepened hatred between faiths, and justified acts of unimaginable cruelty in the name of God. The massacres, the betrayals, the cities burned to the ground, all left scars on the pages of history. And though the wars ended, the echoes of that struggle remained, shaping to the relationship between East and West for generations. By the 14th century, the era of the Crusades had passed. The once mighty Crusader states crumbled, their fortresses abandoned, their banners torn. Yet Europe stood transformed. The age of knights and holy wars gave way to something new, a world where trade and diplomacy took precedence over conquest, where knowledge and culture began to flourish in ways the Crusaders never imagined. But even as one chapter closed, another began. By the 13th century, as Crusader banners fell, a storm gathered on the eastern steppes, a tempest that would dwarf the holy wars in scale and savagery. The Mongols were coming, and with them came not just war, but the fall of kingdoms, the ruin of empires, and the end of entire civilizations. For centuries, the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe bred fierce warriors, nomadic tribes who lived on horseback, who knew no walls, and who answered to no king. But never before had they been united. Never before had they moved as one unstoppable force. That changed in the early 13th century when a single man rose from obscurity, a man who reshaped the fate of nations. His name was Temujin. History remembers him as Genghis Khan. What began as a tribal feud in the Mongolian steppes soon became something far greater. Genghis Khan forged scattered clans into an empire of warriors, bound not by blood but by loyalty and conquest. His armies moved with terrifying speed, striking like lightning, their banners black against the sky. And once they had conquered the vast reaches of China and Central Asia, they turned their eyes westward, to the Islamic world, to the cities of Persia, to the great kingdoms of Eastern Europe. The Mongol invasion came not as a single war, but as a storm that swept over entire civilizations. In 1223, the first Mongol scouts appeared on the borders of Kievan Rus, a loose federation of Slavic principalities. At first, the Rus princes dismissed them as just another band of nomadic raiders. They were wrong. At the Battle of the Kalka River, the Mongols annihilated the Rus forces, crushing their cavalry and slaughtering their nobles. But this was only a taste of what was to come. The Mongols did not stay. Not yet. Like a predator testing its prey, they withdrew, vanishing back into the steppe. Then, in 1237, they returned. This time, they did not come as raiders. They came as conquerors. Led by Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, the Mongol horde swept through Kievan Rus with a fury unlike anything Europe had ever seen. City after city fell. Ryazan burned. Vladimir was reduced to rubble. Kiev, once the heart of Slavic civilization, was destroyed so completely that years later, travelers would say there was nothing left but ruins and bones. The Mongols showed no mercy. Those who resisted were slaughtered. Those who surrendered were enslaved. By 1240, Kievan Rus was no more. What remained was a shattered land, now under the iron grip of the Mongol yoke. But Eastern Europe was not their only target. Further south, the Mongols thundered into the Middle East. The great Islamic world, once so powerful, found itself unprepared for the sheer brutality of the Mongol war machine. In 1258, under the leadership of Hulagu Khan, the Mongols laid siege to Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. For centuries, Baghdad had been a center of learning, home to scholars, poets, and philosophers. But the Mongols had no interest in knowledge. They wanted submission, and when it was not given, they brought only destruction. The city was sacked. The great libraries of the House of Wisdom, filled with centuries of accumulated knowledge, were set aflame. The Tigris River, it was said, ran black with ink and red with blood. The last Abbasid caliph was trampled to death, and the Islamic world was left in ruins. Yet the Mongols were not merely conquerors. Their empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, and with it came something unexpected: connection. Though their methods were brutal, the Mongols created the first truly global empire, linking the East and the West in ways that had never been seen before. The Silk Road, once fragmented and dangerous, now flourished under Mongol rule. Merchants, scholars, and travelers moved freely across lands that had once been at war. Spices, silk, and knowledge flowed between civilizations. It was through Mongol hands that gunpowder, paper, and even the Black Death spread across continents. The Mongols also changed the nature of warfare itself. Their armies were unlike anything the medieval world had ever faced. Lightning-fast, ruthlessly disciplined, and endlessly adaptable, they fought with precision, using tactics no European knight or Persian warrior could match. Psychological warfare was their weapon of choice, breaking the spirit of cities long before a single arrow was loosed. They captured engineers from China and Persia, building siege weapons more advanced than anything seen in the West. There were no fixed battle lines, no reliance on heavy armor, no chivalric ideals, only victory, achieved at any cost. But even the fiercest storms pass. In time, the Mongol Empire began to fracture. The vast dominion built by Genghis Khan was divided among his descendants, splintering into 4 khanates, each ruling a different corner of the world. The Golden Horde dominated the remnants of Kievan Rus, forcing Slavic princes into submission for generations. In the Middle East, Mongol supremacy faltered as rising powers pushed back. The once unified empire, built on unrelenting conquest, could not hold together forever. Still, the Mongols left behind more than ruins. The fall of Kievan Rus reshaped Eastern Europe, clearing the path for the rise of Moscow and a new Russian identity. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 marked the twilight of the Islamic Golden Age, a cultural catastrophe that sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. And through the trade routes they protected and expanded, the Mongols linked distant civilizations, creating a network of exchange that outlasted their empire. The Crusades had reshaped the medieval world, but the Mongols had torn it apart and reassembled it in ways no one could have foreseen. Once proud kingdoms were reduced to ashes, fragmented trade routes became threads in the first true global web, and warfare itself was no longer a noble duel in armor. It had become a fast, calculated storm of terror. The world of the Middle Ages never remained the same. Empires crumbled, kingdoms fell, and ancient orders broke apart. Yet, from the ashes of war, something unexpected began to rise, not in the clamor of swords, but in the quiet murmur of ideas. War had redrawn the map of the known world, but it had also opened roads. Trade routes once broken were now bustling with life, stitched together by Mongol horsemen and merchant caravans. Along these routes flowed not just goods, but knowledge, ideas, texts, and wisdom long thought lost. And in this turbulent aftermath, something took root, a flicker of light in the long shadow of the Dark Ages. It could not be crushed by arrows or burned by siege fire. It was knowledge. For centuries, learning in medieval Europe had been little more than a flickering candle, its light dim against the vast darkness of war, superstition, and isolation. The fall of the Roman Empire hadn't just collapsed borders, it shattered the institutions of learning. Libraries were burned, scholars scattered, and knowledge faded into silence. For generations, the pursuit of wisdom became the quiet labor of monks, copying ancient texts in silent monasteries. But now, the world was changing. Ideas flowed once more along the roads of merchants and pilgrims, carried in the hands of scholars who traveled between lands that had long been strangers to one another. The East had given Europe more than just spices and silk. It had given them Aristotle, algebra, and the forgotten wisdom of the ancients. In the great cities of Europe, in the heart of cathedrals and bustling marketplaces, a new kind of institution began to emerge. A gathering of minds, a place where scholars could debate, question, and seek truth, not through the authority of rulers, but through reason. The first great universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, did not appear overnight. They grew out of cathedral schools, places where clergy had once been trained in theology and scripture. But over time, these schools became something greater. They attracted students from across Christendom, young men eager to study not only faith, but philosophy, medicine, law, and the sciences. In Bologna, the study of Roman law flourished, preserving and adapting the legal traditions that had once governed an empire. In Paris, the Sorbonne became the heart of theological inquiry, where the greatest minds of the age wrestled with questions of God, existence, and the nature of reality itself. And in Oxford, the seeds of a new intellectual movement were planted, one that challenged the very foundations of medieval thought. It was a method, a way of thinking, but above all, it was a revolution. In an age where knowledge had been dictated by tradition, this movement asked something radical. What if faith and reason could work together? What if truth was not just something to be accepted, but something to be discovered through logic and debate? At the heart of this movement stood one man, Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar, a thinker, and perhaps one of the most influential minds in medieval history. Aquinas did something extraordinary. He took the philosophy of Aristotle, an ancient Greek thinker whose works had been preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars, and brought it into the heart of Christian thought. For centuries, Aristotle's ideas had been seen as dangerous, even heretical. He spoke of reason, of logic, of a world governed not just by divine will but by natural laws. Yet Aquinas argued that faith and reason were not enemies. Rather, they were two sides of the same truth. His great work, the Summa Theologica, became the cornerstone of medieval philosophy, shaping the way scholars, theologians, and even rulers thought about knowledge, law, and the universe itself. But beyond the grand halls of universities, beyond the Latin debates and theological disputes, the rise of education was having an even greater effect. For the first time in centuries, literacy was spreading beyond the walls of the church. The sons of merchants, craftsmen, and even some nobility sought knowledge not just for salvation, but for power, for influence in a world that was shifting away from feudalism and towards something new. Universities produced not just priests and monks, but lawyers, physicians, and administrators. They trained the minds that built the bureaucracies of kings, the legal systems of nations, and the intellectual foundations of the Renaissance still on the horizon. And yet, even as the universities flourished, they remained bound by the world that created them. Knowledge stayed guarded, still restricted to the elite. Books were precious, hand-copied, locked in great libraries where only the privileged could read them. Women, for the most part, remained denied access to education. their intellectual pursuits confined to convents or the rare noble court that encouraged learning. The church, too, remained both patron and gatekeeper, funding great centers of study while keeping a watchful eye over those who strayed too far from doctrine. The rise of medieval universities marked more than a revival of learning. It signaled the beginning of transformation. A shift from a world where knowledge belonged to the few to one where ideas spread like wildfire. It didn't happen overnight. It took centuries, but the seeds were already in the ground. The minds challenging the old order, sparking revolutions in science, politics, and philosophy, were already forming in the lecture halls of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. The Middle Ages began in darkness, in the ruins of a fallen empire, in a world where knowledge had been hoarded and lost. But as the 14th century dawned, that world began to change. The universities laid the foundation, the scholastic thinkers built the framework, and soon the Renaissance brought those ideas fully into the light. For the medieval world, the age of knights and conquests was fading, the age of reason was rising. But knowledge didn't travel alone. As scholars, merchants, and pilgrims moved across continents, carrying new ideas, they also carried something else, something far more deadly. No one saw it coming, but the same roads that brought wisdom and progress now prepared to deliver disaster. Knowledge had taken root in the great universities of Europe, and ideas once confined to monasteries were now being debated in lecture halls and city squares. The rigid structures of medieval life were beginning to bend, slowly, imperceptibly. But change was coming. No one knew it yet, but the world was standing on the edge of a catastrophe unlike anything it had ever seen. A force of nature, invisible and unstoppable, was about to tear through the heart of Europe, leaving death, despair, and transformation in its wake. It began in the East in the sprawling trade networks that linked Europe to the distant riches of Asia. In 1347, it arrived in Europe. 12 ships docked in the Sicilian port of Messina, their sails tattered, their crews nearly lifeless. The people who came to investigate found a horror beyond comprehension. Sailors covered in blackened boils, writhing in agony, coughing blood, their bodies burning with fever. Within days, the disease spread through the city and then beyond. The ships had brought more than goods from the east. They had brought death itself. No one knew what it was. No one understood how it spread. Some believed it was a punishment from God, a divine retribution for the sins of mankind. Others whispered that it was the work of witches or a deadly miasma rising from the earth. Panic took hold as the disease tore through villages, towns, and cities with terrifying speed. People who seemed healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall. Priests, doctors, and scholars, none could stop it. The streets were filled with the sick and the dying, and soon with the dead. The stench of decay hung thick in the air. Entire households perished, leaving homes abandoned, doors swinging open in the wind. As the weeks passed, the plague moved like wildfire across Europe. From Italy, it spread to France, Spain, and England, then to Germany, Scandinavia, and beyond. No kingdom was spared, no city untouched. The death toll climbed higher and higher. It did not discriminate. It took peasants and nobles alike, merchants and priests, children and kings. In England, entire villages vanished, their fields left untended, their homes crumbling into ruin. In Paris, the graveyards overflowed, forcing bodies to be buried in mass pits. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI was forced to consecrate the river Rhône because there was no more space to bury the dead. The living fled in terror, abandoning their families, their homes, their livelihoods. By the time the first wave of the plague had passed, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population lay dead. But the devastation was far from over. The disease would return again and again, striking in waves over the next decades, reshaping the very fabric of society. The sheer scale of loss sent shockwaves through every aspect of life, social, economic, political, and even spiritual. This was not just a plague, it was an earthquake that shattered the foundations of the medieval world. The social order, already strained by war and famine, began to unravel. In a world where feudalism had been built on the power of lords and the servitude of peasants, the sudden disappearance of entire communities upended everything. The labor force collapsed, fields went unplowed, harvests rotted in the sun, and once prosperous estates fell into ruin. The nobles, who had once ruled over vast lands with an iron grip, now found themselves desperate for workers to till their fields. And for the first time in centuries, the balance of power began to shift. The surviving peasants, once bound to the land by law and custom, suddenly found themselves in demand. Lords competed for workers, offering better wages and conditions. Peasants who had once been little more than serfs now had the leverage to demand higher pay, shorter hours, and even freedom. Some abandoned their villages altogether, seeking a better life in growing towns and cities. Others took advantage of the chaos to rise in status, accumulating land and wealth. The rigid hierarchy that had defined medieval society was beginning to crack. This newfound power did not go unnoticed. The ruling elite, fearful of losing control, attempted to stop the shift. In England, King Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, a desperate attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from leaving their lords. But laws could not stop the tide of change. Peasant uprisings broke out across Europe. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the Jacquerie in France, the revolts in Flanders and Germany, all fueled by resentment, by hunger, by a world that no longer made sense. The old order fought to maintain its grip, but the world had already begun to slip through its fingers. The impact of the Black Death reached far beyond the economy. It reshaped religion itself. The Church, which had long stood as the supreme authority in medieval life, was shaken to its core. When the plague struck, priests and monks either perished in great numbers or fled, leaving the faithful without guidance. Those who survived often found themselves disillusioned. If God had sent this plague as punishment, why had the righteous fallen alongside the wicked? Why had prayers gone unanswered? Why had the Church, the supposed pillar of Christendom, proven powerless against the devastation? A deep spiritual crisis took hold. Some turned to extreme piety, joining flagellant movements, marching through cities, whipping themselves in an attempt to atone for humanity's sins. Others turned away from the Church entirely, seeking answers elsewhere. Dissenting voices grew louder. New sects emerged, questioning the authority of the clergy, laying the groundwork for religious upheaval that would come in later centuries. The unquestioned dominance of the Catholic Church was no longer absolute, and yet, out of the ashes of despair, something new was emerging. The plague had left Europe scarred, but it had also set change into motion. The collapse of feudalism, the rise of a more mobile workforce, the weakening of rigid social structures. These shifts would lay the foundation for the world to come. Towns and cities, no longer shackled to a dying feudal economy, became centers of commerce, banking, and innovation. Trade routes, once crippled by the devastation, slowly revived. And as they did, so too did the spread of knowledge. The same universities that had been flourishing in the early 14th century faced devastation during the plague years. Professors and students alike perished, and schools closed their doors. But those that survived adapted. A new hunger for knowledge arose, not just theological study, but practical learning. Medicine, anatomy, and the sciences took on new importance. The study of disease, of human health, of the natural world. These would all become driving forces in the centuries to come. The medieval world had been shaken to its core, but in its place, something new was taking shape. The rigid structures that had defined life for generations were breaking apart. The unquestioned authority of the nobility was crumbling, the monopoly of the Church was fracturing, the idea that a person's fate was fixed by birth, that the world was unchanging, was beginning to fade. By the early 14th century, Europe was already teetering on the edge. Economic pressures, social unrest, and the deepening rivalry between kingdoms were unraveling the medieval order. And then, in 1337, a spark ignited a conflict that would burn for more than a century. A war not just between two crowns, but between two worlds, one fading, one rising. This was the beginning of the 100 Years' War. It all began with a question of blood. The French king, Charles IV, died in 1328 without a male heir, leaving the throne of France contested. According to French law, the crown could not pass through a woman, excluding Charles's sister, Isabella. But Isabella's son, Edward III of England, saw things differently. As the grandson of the old French king Philip IV, he believed his claim was just as legitimate. The French nobility, however, disagreed, crowning Philip VI of the Valois dynasty instead. Tensions escalated quickly. England still held vast territories in France, including Aquitaine, and disputes over feudal rights and sovereignty were boiling over. When Edward III formally declared himself the rightful king of France in 1337, war became inevitable. What followed was not one long war, but a series of brutal campaigns, uneasy truces, and political betrayals spanning generations. Initially, it seemed like a typical medieval struggle: noble knights, castle sieges, and feudal armies. But the 100 Years' War would become something much more, a crucible that reshaped the very nature of warfare and power. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, that transformation began. The English, outnumbered and facing the traditional might of French cavalry, deployed a revolutionary weapon, the longbow. These 6-foot-tall bows, in the hands of well-trained archers, unleashed deadly volleys of armor-piercing arrows. The French knights, symbols of chivalric pride, fell in droves. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was the death knell of an old order. Then, in 1356, came the Battle of Poitiers. Once again, the longbow proved decisive. The English not only routed the French forces, but captured their king, John II. His ransom nearly bankrupted France. The old model of feudal levies, lords raising armies from their vassals, was proving unreliable and outdated. Kings began to realize they needed something new: standing armies, paid soldiers loyal not to local lords, but to the crown. And it wasn't just the bow changing warfare. By the late 14th century, another force was arriving on the battlefield: gunpowder. At first clumsy and unreliable, cannons soon evolved into devastating siege weapons. By the time of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the English once again overcame overwhelming odds, aided by longbows, clever tactics, and a changing tide in military technology. Behind the scenes, cannons were starting to render once impenetrable castles obsolete. Stone walls that had stood for centuries could now be shattered in hours. The feudal lords who had ruled from their fortresses were losing their grip. Warfare was becoming centralized, controlled by monarchs, funded through national taxes, not the scattered pledges of nobles. This shift also unleashed something even more profound: the rise of national identity. For centuries, people had thought of themselves as subjects of a lord, residents of a manor. But now, in the fires of war, new identities were forming. People were beginning to see themselves as English or French, not just peasants or vassals, but members of a nation. And nowhere was that spirit more vividly embodied than in the story of Joan of Arc. By the 1420s, France was on the brink of collapse. The English, allied with the powerful Burgundians, controlled vast swaths of territory. The French king, Charles VII, had been disinherited. Morale was shattered. But then came Joan, a teenage peasant girl from Domremy who claimed to hear voices from saints. Against all odds, she convinced Charles to let her lead an army. In 1429, she led a miraculous victory at Orléans, lifting the siege and rallying a dying kingdom. Her courage reawakened French pride. Though she was eventually captured and burned at the stake, her martyrdom lit a fire that couldn't be extinguished. When the war finally ended in 1453, the world had irrevocably changed. England retained only Calais. France, once fragmented, had emerged as a centralized monarchy. The age of the knight was over. Feudal lords had been weakened. Kings now ruled through taxation and professional armies. The castle, once a symbol of medieval dominance, had become a relic. The modern European state was being born. And yet, even in victory, Europe remained uneasy. The 100 Years' War had not just redrawn borders, it had shattered a world view. The pillars of medieval life, nobility, chivalry, faith, and feudalism, had all been tested. What rose in their place was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the medieval world was fading. The Renaissance loomed on the horizon, but before Europe could embrace that new dawn, it would pass through one final crucible, a storm of rebellion, heresy, and reform that would tear down the last remnants of the old world. The late medieval period and the dawn of change had begun. The 100 Years' War had ended, but the forces it unleashed were far from over. The feudal order had been stripped of its power. Standing armies replaced knights. Centralized kingdoms began to rise. The world that emerged from the ashes of medieval warfare was unlike the one that had existed before. It was a world in flux where old traditions clashed with new realities and where the medieval order was rapidly dissolving. For centuries, feudalism had shaped European society. Kings ruled in name but depended on vassals to maintain control. Land defined wealth, and loyalty was exchanged for protection. But by the late medieval period, this system was crumbling. The war had exposed the unreliability of feudal levies. Noble vassals often served their own interests before the crown's. Warfare itself had evolved. Knights in shining armor, bound by chivalric codes, were now obsolete. Kings began assembling professional armies, soldiers who fought for pay, not fealty. With centralized taxation, monarchs could fund their own forces and bypass the nobility altogether. But the collapse of feudalism extended beyond the battlefield. In many regions, serfdom disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, the cities were changing too. Trade had flourished, creating a new economic sphere outside the traditional feudal hierarchy. Merchant guilds controlled commerce. Banking families, especially in Italy, amassed immense wealth. Unlike feudal lords, their power came from trade and finance, not land. In cities like Venice, Florence, and Bruges, these merchants shaped local governance and influenced kings by financing their wars. The nobility now faced competition from a rising middle class. This economic shift mirrored a broader transformation of political power. If feudalism weakened the nobility, it strengthened monarchs. France offered a prime example. After a century of war, it emerged not as a loose collection of fiefdoms, but as a centralized kingdom. Charles VII and Louis XI dismantled noble autonomy, bringing provinces under direct royal control. With new tax systems funding permanent armies, the monarchy wielded unprecedented authority. France was no longer ruled by competing lords. It was ruled by the king alone. England, too, saw its monarchy redefined. The Wars of the Roses devastated the country, pitting noble houses against one another, but from the wreckage rose a new dynasty. The Tudors, starting with Henry VII, restored order and ended generations of feudal infighting. By the close of the 15th century, the English crown was stronger than ever, poised to usher in an age of centralized rule. Elsewhere in Europe, the same trend unfolded. In Spain, the 1469 marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united two dominant Christian realms. In 1492, they completed the Reconquista, expelling the last Muslim rulers from Granada and unifying the Iberian Peninsula under a single Christian monarchy. But their ambitions extended beyond the battlefield. They diminished noble influence, centralized authority, and laid the foundations of a global empire that would soon span continents. Even the Holy Roman Empire, long a patchwork of semi-independent states, began feeling the pull of centralization. Though still fragmented, powerful rulers were asserting control over their territories, curbing the autonomy of rebellious nobles, and striving, if unevenly, to unify their lands. Across the continent, monarchs were no longer just figureheads or first among equals. They were becoming sovereign rulers in their own right. But power wasn't the only thing shifting. The very fabric of European society was being rewritten. For centuries, the social hierarchy had been rigid: nobles and clergy on top, merchants and artisans in the middle, peasants at the bottom. But the economic forces of the late medieval period blurred these lines. A new middle class, wealthy, educated, and urban, was rising. Lawyers, doctors, scholars, and merchants gained influence once reserved for aristocrats. At the same time, knowledge itself was breaking free from its medieval bounds. Universities, once confined to monasteries, were now thriving in cities. A new intellectual movement, humanism, was taking root. Scholars looked to the classical works of Greece and Rome, emphasizing reason, inquiry, and individual potential. The old world view, dominated by religious orthodoxy, was being challenged. Technology accelerated this cultural shift. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century revolutionized the spread of knowledge. Once limited to hand-copied manuscripts, books could now be mass-produced. Ideas traveled faster and farther than ever before. Europe had endured centuries of chaos, war, famine, plague. Kingdoms had crumbled. Feudal lords had risen and fallen, villages had vanished. But now, something new was stirring. The old world had collapsed, and in its place, a new world was taking shape. One driven not only by survival, but by curiosity, rediscovery, and ambition. The Renaissance had arrived. The world that had endured so much war, famine, plague, was now standing on the edge of transformation. The medieval order had collapsed, and from its ruins a new age was emerging. It would be an age unlike any before it, one that sought not only survival, but enlightenment. The Renaissance was here, and Europe would never be the same. But this rebirth did not come from nowhere. It had been centuries in the making, forged through hardship, loss, and the relentless search for knowledge. And though the Renaissance is often remembered as an explosion of art, science, and human creativity, its roots stretched far deeper, back into the darkness of the Middle Ages, back to the intellectual ruins left by the fall of Rome, and back to the long-forgotten wisdom of the ancient world, waiting to be rediscovered. In the aftermath of the medieval era's collapse, Europe was not simply recovering. It was reinventing itself. Cities had grown in size and influence, economies were diversifying, and rulers were no longer merely warriors, but administrators, patrons, and diplomats. And as the power of the feudal lords waned, a new class of people was rising: the merchants, the scholars, the thinkers. These were the people who would guide Europe into its next age, not with the sword, but with ideas. But before those ideas could flourish, before Renaissance thinkers could revolutionize the world, they first had to unearth the knowledge of those who had come before them. The road to the Renaissance was paved with rediscovery. For centuries, much of the knowledge of the ancient world had been lost, or so it seemed. The great intellectual achievements of Greece and Rome had been buried beneath the weight of medieval conflict, hidden in crumbling manuscripts or forgotten entirely. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century had marked the beginning of an age of decline, where Europe's focus had shifted from philosophy and science to mere survival. The turmoil of the Dark Ages had left little room for intellectual pursuits. Libraries had been burned, scholars had been scattered, and the works of thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, and Galen had faded into obscurity. But they had not disappeared entirely. Some of these texts had been preserved, not in Europe, but in the libraries of the Islamic world. While Europe struggled through centuries of instability, the Muslim world had flourished as a center of learning. In cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars had translated and preserved the great works of antiquity. Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, and Persian mathematics had been studied, expanded upon, and safeguarded by Islamic scholars. The House of Wisdom in 890 Baghdad had been a beacon of intellectual life, where texts long forgotten in Europe had been meticulously copied, analyzed, and improved. The medical knowledge of Hippocrates and Galen had been built upon by figures like Avicenna, while Aristotle's philosophy had been explored and debated by thinkers like Averroes. Algebra, astronomy, optics, all had thrived in the Islamic world, while Europe remained in intellectual darkness. And when contact between these civilizations increased through trade, through war, through the slow diffusion of cultures, this knowledge began making its way back into Europe. The Crusades had played an unexpected role in this exchange. Though they were waged as brutal conflicts between Christian and Muslim forces, they also became channels of cultural transmission. European crusaders, upon encountering the intellectual achievements of the Islamic world, brought back not just goods and wealth, but ideas. They returned with translations of ancient texts, medical techniques far beyond those practiced in medieval Europe, and mathematical concepts that would later revolutionize science. The knowledge preserved in the Islamic world was re-entering Europe, setting the stage for a new era of intellectual exploration. But it was not only through the Islamic world that ancient knowledge found its way back to Europe. In the eastern reaches of Christendom, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the last bastion of Roman civilization. While Western Europe had fragmented into feudal kingdoms, Constantinople had remained a thriving center of learning. The scholars of Byzantium had preserved much of classical Greek and Roman knowledge, keeping alive the works of Plato, Euclid, and Ptolemy. But in 1453, the unthinkable happened. The city fell. The Ottoman Empire, led by Mehmed the Conqueror, had stormed the walls of Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire once and for all. And as the city burned, its scholars fled, many of them heading westward, carrying with them their most precious possessions, books, manuscripts, and the last remnants of an ancient intellectual tradition. Their arrival in Italy marked a turning point. The knowledge they brought with them would spark a renewed interest in the classical world, inspiring a generation of thinkers, artists, and scientists to look beyond the confines of medieval thought. Europe was now ready to reclaim its lost heritage, to rebuild its intellectual foundations, and to embark on a journey of rediscovery that would transform every aspect of society. But knowledge alone was not enough. It needed a home, a place where it could be studied, debated, and expanded upon. That home would be the universities. The rise of universities had been one of the most significant developments of the late medieval period. Institutions like the University of Bologna, the University of Paris, and Oxford had begun as centers of theological study but had gradually expanded their scope to include law, medicine, and philosophy. These universities became the crucibles of European intellectual life, where scholars could challenge old assumptions and explore new ideas. And while much of their curriculum remained rooted in medieval scholasticism, the rigid method of learning that sought to reconcile Christian doctrine with classical philosophy, change was coming. The rediscovery of ancient texts had sparked a hunger for knowledge that went beyond theology. Aristotle was being studied not just as a tool for religious argument, but as a philosopher in his own right. The medical theories of Galen were being re-examined, leading to new advancements in anatomy and physiology. Even mathematics was evolving, as European scholars began integrating the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, replacing the cumbersome Roman numerals that had long hindered scientific progress. At the heart of this intellectual revival were the humanists. These were scholars who believed in the power of human reason, in the study of classical texts, and in the idea that knowledge should serve not just the church, but society as a whole. Figures like Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, sought to revive the literature, history, and moral philosophy of the ancient world. Rather than simply accepting medieval interpretations of classical texts, they wanted to go back to the originals, to read and understand them as they were meant to be understood. This shift, from blind adherence to medieval scholasticism to a direct engagement with classical sources, would become the foundation of Renaissance thought. And yet, the Renaissance was not merely a scholarly movement. It was a revolution in the way people saw the world. Art, science, politics, every aspect of life was beginning to change. The struggles of the past had shaped this new age, providing both the obstacles and the motivation for its emergence. The Black Death, for all its devastation, had weakened the grip of the church and traditional authority, allowing new ideas to take root. The 100 Years' War had given rise to centralized states that could now support artists, architects, and scientists. The collapse of feudalism had created a society where individuals, no longer bound by rigid medieval structures, could aspire to greatness based on talent, ambition, and intellect. The world was no longer defined solely by divine will or the rigid hierarchies of feudalism. Instead, it was becoming a world of possibility, of human potential, of boundless curiosity. The Renaissance was not just a return to the past, it was a leap into the future. And as Europe stood at the threshold of this new age, the greatest minds of the time would step forward, not as warriors or kings, but as visionaries who would forever change the course of history. The road to the Renaissance had been long and arduous, marked by war, plague, and the collapse of an entire way of life. But now at last, the dawn had arrived. For centuries, the term Dark Ages has conjured images of a world in ruin, of crumbling empires, lost knowledge, and a Europe swallowed by chaos. It has been painted as a time of stagnation, of regression, a long and bleak night between the brilliance of Rome and the dawn of the Renaissance. And yet, as we have seen, this was not the full truth. Yes, the medieval world was a time of war, of famine, of kingdoms rising and falling, of great uncertainty. But it was also an era of resilience, adaptation, and profound transformation. It was not a void of progress, but but a crucible, a testing ground where old ways shattered and new ideas emerged. The struggles of the Middle Ages were not just tragedies, they were the catalysts that forced Europe to evolve. The fall of Rome did not erase civilization, it forced people to build new societies from its remnants. The wars that plagued the continent did not destroy order. They reshaped it, carving the borders of modern nations. The Black Death did not bring an end to human ambition. It set the stage for economic shifts, labor movements, and the questioning of long-held institutions. Even feudalism, once the foundation of medieval life, was not eternal. It crumbled, but in its place, centralized kingdoms, powerful monarchies, and the seeds of the modern state began to grow. And then, of course, there was knowledge. It is tempting to believe that the classical wisdom of Greece and Rome simply vanished into the abyss of time. But it did not. It lay scattered, hidden in monasteries preserved by Islamic scholars, whispered through the halls of medieval universities. And when Europe was ready, when it had endured its long trial, it reached back into its own past and reclaimed what had been lost. The Renaissance was not a sudden explosion of brilliance. It was a slow awakening, built upon the foundations laid during the so-called Dark Ages. Without those centuries of quiet preservation, of slow intellectual struggle, of monks copying ancient texts by candlelight, and scholars debating in the halls of medieval universities, the Renaissance may never have happened at all. So was the Dark Ages truly dark? Or was it simply misunderstood? Perhaps it was not a period of darkness, but rather one of transition, a bridge between worlds, between the old and the new. To call it dark is to dismiss the struggles of those who lived through it, to ignore the ingenuity, the endurance, and the silent, relentless march of progress that carried Europe forward. The truth is, history is never as simple as light and dark. The past is not a straight path from ignorance to enlightenment, nor is it a series of ages neatly divided into golden eras and lost ones. The medieval world was neither a failure nor a pause in history. It was a chapter, a long, difficult, but necessary chapter in the story of human civilization, and without it, the modern world as we know it would not exist. So as we leave behind the Middle Ages and step into the dawn of the Renaissance, we do so not by looking down upon the past, but by recognizing the weight it carries. The Dark Ages were not an age of decline. They were an age of transformation, and from their trials, a new world was born.